Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the London School of Economics and Political Science. My name is Megan Palmer, and I manage the Central and Southeast Europe programme at the LSE Ideas. I'm very pleased today to bring this event to you in collaboration with the RATSU Forum, our partners in the programme. And today's panel will be on the subject of immigration into Eastern Europe, rather provocatively titled perhaps, New Challenges. So before we begin, I would like to introduce our panelists. We are joined by Remus Anghel, who is a senior researcher at the Romanian Institute for Research on Minorities. We're joined from Latvia by Inta Mieriņa, who is at the University of Latvia and director of the Center for Diaspora and Migration Research. We're joined from Croatia by Carolina Hornstein Tomić, who is senior researcher at the Ivo Pilar Institute of Social Sciences. And finally, we're joined from the UK by Michal Garapich, who is senior lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Roehampton. So we're going to ask each panelist to give a short presentation on an area of their research focus, and then we will open up the panel to a discussion along with audience questions. So to begin with, I would like to hand over to Remus. Remus, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Megan. It's first a great pleasure to talk in your forum. I'll talk a little bit about migration in Eastern Europe and patterns of immigration going on and what we observed in the past years. So first of all, migration was perhaps one of the most important social processes affecting Eastern Europe after '89. We can remember that before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, international migration was restricted by these countries as a means to control the population, so that East European populations were thirsty to be able to go out to see the Western world and to experience it. The dream and wishes of Eastern Europeans materialized soon after, as in the past 30 years, Central Eastern Europe was the main reservoir of labor for West European economies, so that we've seen quite a lot of changes in this respect. And in the UK, for instance, in the past 10 years, Central Eastern Europe was also very important. I mean, people from Poland or Romania migrated towards the UK, but also Germany, Italy, Spain, France, Netherlands experienced the same inflows of East Europeans. So quite a lot of discourses and research was targeting the emigration of Eastern Europeans to Western Europe. At the same time, in the countries of origin, there were quite many debates on the effects of this migration, and the most visible one was the loss of population and brain drain of young, talented people. But at the same time, there were different forms of exchange and remittances, so always there was positive and negative sides of emigration. But in order to provide kind of glimpse into the whole situation, in terms of population losses, Romania lost about 4 million people out of 23 in the past 30 years, and it is expected to decrease with another 4 million, roughly because of two processes, low natality and emigration. Bulgaria is the same, lost 2 million people so far, and we lose another 2.5 million until 2050. So in terms of the population, we've seen regions, at least in Romania, almost depopulated with very, very few young people, and there will be effects in terms of the number of older people being much more than younger people who will continue to migrate. At the same time, these countries experience growth, and there is a question of why and how this migration continues despite the fact that there is growth, and in many parts of the country, people are living much better than before. And in order to address this issue is that in economic growth and development occur in a context of growing inequalities between regions, between cities, between social strata, so that in some parts of the country or cities, people are living well, in some other parts that they aren't living well and they are forced to continue migrating. And governments in this region, at least Romania, Bulgaria, but some other countries also, So two main options to deal with the situation. On the one hand, to try to encourage return of those who migrated. At the same time, in the past years, to try to encourage immigration. And we've seen that in Romania, for instance, the number of Vietnamese is growing, the number of Turks is growing. So even though a lot of discourses were about emigration and the effects of emigration, less visible is the fact that those countries are starting to become also countries of immigration. And this is a new reality with which the region is not necessarily accustomed. So this is a new exercise and practice that will occur. So far, in terms of different trends of immigration, we can have different types of migrants. There are ethnic migrants, usually co-ethnics living in neighboring countries. There are also labor migrants, Western Europeans who move to Eastern Europe in smaller numbers, of course. At the same time, refugees in some countries. I mean, Hungary experienced a strong wave of refugees. Serbia experienced also refugees. Romania less, but still it's a pattern of migration that will increase. From all these types of migration so far, some countries experience much more ethnic migration. And ethnic migration, it's the migration of the co-ethnics living in neighboring countries. I mean, if you are looking 100 years ago, the maps of Europe was a map of empires in Central Eastern Europe, right? And when the new nation states formed, these borders of new nation states never coincided with ethnic groups living in the territory. So basically, there were large ethnic minorities in much of these countries. And this situation continued even today. I mean, Romania has large minority of Hungarians, for instance. Serbia has a minority of Hungarians. Slovakia has a minority of Hungarians. There are Poles in Ukraine. Moldovans are actually ethnic Romanians. And what happened in the past 20, 30 years, because of different economic differences between these countries, these people started to come to the so-called mother countries, right? So if you're looking at Hungary, that officially opposes immigration, ethnic Hungarians are welcomed. And the largest number of immigrants in Hungary are actually Transylvanian Hungarians. There were roughly 200,000. Also in Romania, there were very many Moldovans who arrived in the past 10, 15 years. Also about 200,000, at least in the last data. So slowly, even though there isn't much debate in this migration, these countries are still becoming countries of immigration. I will pass then to Inta Mieriņa, who will continue to discuss different other patterns of immigration and also government responses. And then I'll, of course, join to the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Remus. So Inta, if you'd like to unmute yourself and please continue the discussion. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for the organizers, for the opportunity to join you today. I'd like to just start with briefly highlighting why is this topic so important to us at this time in Central and Eastern Europe. Over the years, it has become increasingly clear that human capital is one of the main resources of development. However, as Remus has already highlighted, Central and Eastern Europe has suffered great human capital losses due to immigration. And nowadays, economists, and in Latvia, for example, the Ministry of Economics is openly talking about insufficient labor supply and structural labor market deficits, that they are already slowing the GDP growth, direct investments, innovation, and overall economic prospects of some of the Central Eastern European countries. The potential for attracting labor from the economically inactive population is almost exhausted. If you look at the statistics, then we have many pensioners, young people, women in the labor market, so there's really not much to draw from. And demographic trends show that labor market shortages will only get worse. What this means is that we will need targeted policies to attract labor force from abroad. And this realization has been growing in Central and Eastern Europe, in some countries faster than in others, but this is really the tendencies that we are seeing. This constitutes a huge challenge for Central and Eastern European countries, as they have to compete for qualified labor with other EU countries that oftentimes offer much better wages and conditions. And also, as I will explain later, they have to deal with the negative attitudes of the local population, which I believe is really the main obstacle to tackle. The social and political climate in Central and Eastern Europe has certainly not been favorable to immigration. People overwhelmingly do not recognize the contribution of immigrants to the country's economic growth, and they are not eager to welcome them, as we can see, for example, from Eurobarometer data. A large majority of the population, they perceive immigration, and particularly the immigration of third country nationals, negatively or even very negatively. And interestingly, immigration, even at the backdrop of all the economic problems, immigration is the highest on the list of citizens' priorities and concerns, despite the fact that these countries at least have very low immigration rates. And people also admit to being poorly informed about immigration and the integration matters. And so what I want to say is that it's important to note that in Central and Eastern Europe, people are no less xenophobic, and in fact even more xenophobic oftentimes than those in the Western Europe. My own research in this regard shows that these attitudes are mainly rooted in ethnic nationalism, resource stress and economic insecurity, general distrust, and the lack of contact with actual migrants, in combination with negative media portrayals of migrants. So really, this is how we can explain these attitudes. Talking about policy response, considering the negative attitudes of population towards immigration, the regulations concerning immigration have so far been very bureaucratic, restricting, focused on protecting the internal labor market, and proposals to ease the entry of foreigners have often been faced with fierce political opposition. And not surprisingly, the immigration rates have also been very low and much below the OECD average. However, we also note in the data that the situation has been changing, and some governments in the region, like Remus noticed, have acknowledged the need for labor migrants and have purposefully been aiming at attracting foreign workers by changing regulations and working on the attractiveness of the country as a migration destination. Estonia, for example, is a nice example. They have a website, Work in Estonia, that is in different ways trying to promote Estonia as a place to live and work. Romania also has launched programs to attract labor force from East Asia. Poland has some similar programs. So we are seeing these countries becoming more open to immigration lately. At the same time, there's a very clear tendency for Central East European governments to prefer ethnic migration, like Remus mentioned as well. Poland, Romania, Hungary have specific programs aimed at attracting co-ethnics from the neighboring countries. Many other countries have developed return migration policies aimed at facilitating return of their nationals. But also realizing that most people will not come back. Most of those who have emigrated will not come back in a short period of time. So these policies also focus on establishing ties and facilitating the engagement of the diaspora in the development of country, even if they do not return. Just as an example, in Latvia, just last year, the diaspora law came into effect. And in Lithuania, there's been a very active and well-funded diaspora and return migration policy for years, trying to, get these massive numbers of people to, at least, some of them to return. And indeed, if you look at statistics, like Remus already mentioned, most immigrants in Central and Eastern European countries are, in fact, their own nationals or co-ethnics returning to their homeland. Such as in Hungary or in Romania, or also in Poland and Latvia, it's very often their own return migrants coming from other countries. At the same time, the pool of potential ethnic migrants is drying up. And immigrants or return migrants, the potential return migrants, they are not always eager to return. For example, Professor Hazans has found that in a matter of 10 years, just 40% of them come back, right? So the majority really does not come back, at least in a short period of time. So this shows that ethnic and return migration is not enough. we need other kinds of migration as well if we want to deal with these looming economic problems. So there are many people searching for refuge in Europe, but at the same time, as you've noticed, East Central European countries have not been willing to accept them, challenging the refugee quotas and being some of the loudest critics of the EU immigration response in general. And overall, the number of refugees that Central Eastern European countries have taken in has been very low, and people's attitudes are overwhelmingly negative. People will be much more willing to accommodate intra-EU immigrants, but this group, however, has not been as eager to come, and their share among immigrants in CEE has been very small. It's from below 10% in Latvia to 25% in Estonia among non-national immigrants. They rarely come to Central Eastern Europe for work, as the Eurostat data come. Mostly, they come for family reasons, and oftentimes as spouses of return migrants. So this just shows that Central Eastern European countries are oftentimes not as attractive destinations for labor market, for labor migration. So this is another obstacle to overcome. Most non-national immigrants in CE countries currently come from outside of the EU. In case of Latvia, for example, majority are Russians who come here due to comfortable language environment. Right? Even though we have to know that the composition of immigration to Central Eastern European countries has started to diversify. Remus mentioned, for example, that there's a sizable proportion of, for example, people from Turkey, China, Iran, Syria, and Romania. There's a sizable Chinese community in Hungary, Vietnamese community in Czechia or in Poland. So we can see that these are oftentimes people from faraway places. It's not just the ethnics or nationals. But what I want to emphasize that what's important that we need to look past pure numbers. What is important is how are these immigrants doing after immigrating? Unfortunately, MIPEX data shows very poor integration outcomes in many Central Eastern European countries, especially, for example, in Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Poland, Bulgaria. Discrimination, especially in the labor market, is common. Insufficient understanding of the specific needs of immigrants. Low level of tolerance, even among those people who directly work with migrants, are just some of the major problems that we also note. So, interestingly, as the Eurobarometer data shows, a large share of society does not even want to foster integration of immigrants. So, not surprisingly, the integration outcomes are also not ideal. For example, in Latvia, 60% of third country nationals do not work. 67% among those who do work receive less than the average wage. So how can we expect migrants to contribute to society if we fail to successfully integrate them? Our surveys also show that return migrants also struggle to reintegrate. We did a survey of more than 3,000 return migrants, and what we found was that just 15% had no problems reintegrating back into the Latvian society that they came from. And as a result, many emigrate again. So they come back and after some time they leave. And in our case, in the Latvian case, it's more than 30% in 4 years' time that leave again. So the question is, what is the point, and can we be really happy looking at these return migration numbers if most of these people emigrate again at some point? So really, the overall conclusion from our study is that while we can notice some positive changes, without easing the regulations and improving the immigration and integration climate, attempts to fill in the structural gaps in the labor market with foreign workers are likely to fall flat. And the attitudes of the society should probably be the first thing to tackle, and also, I guess, the most difficult one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inta, and also thank you, Remus. I'd like now to hand over to Karolina, who will talk about her research, focusing more on the Croatian region. So Karolina, the floor is yours.
Megan, thank you very much. I would first of all like to compliment you, the LSE and Ratio Forum, to take up the migration topic in such a forward-looking manner. From the Croatian point of view, we are talking much more about a future scenario than what is manifest today, but it's timely indeed to imagine Croatia's future as a country of immigration. Definitely, migration, emigration is one of the crucial features of Croatia's transition process. We've seen high immigration numbers since the early 1990s, and the focus of public discourse has therefore been largely on emigration. since the European Union accession in 2013, there was again a dramatic increase of emigration. Up to 300,000 people left within 6 years, which is a small city per year. Now, public discourse shifts into addressing that Croatia needs immigration to compensate labor shortages in key industries such as hospitality, manufacturing, and construction. Policies are slowly but surely responding to the situation. However, if the Croatian labor market is not competitive, it will neither keep nor attract people. And I'm afraid that the year 2020 and COVID-19 could add to the problem. The migration dynamics of the last 3 decades, which were asked to look into, are for the Croatian case also embedded in a much longer tradition, or some say culture, of emigration, which started back in the 19th century and took place throughout the 20th century in different waves. A mix of political and economic reasons for emigration, with different destinations, partly overseas, but increasingly then to Western Europe, especially after the 1960s bilateral agreements for temporary labor migration. In the 1980s, those dynamics consolidated in the way that we saw family reunions, chain migration, and certainly also return. However, return migration was much lower than expected and actually sketched in the policy. The early 90s then was, of course, war-related, forced migration, internal displacements, migration to ethnic majority areas in the neighborhood, and international forced migration. But also since early 90s, people left to continue education and careers abroad. So Croatia has been also a destination for immigrants all along, and this is mostly labor migration from the neighborhood, the wider and Western Balkan area, and historic migrations from Central and Eastern Europe. Today there are 22 recognized minorities in Croatia, which make roughly 10% of the Croatian population. There are other more recent migrant communities also in Croatia, similar to Romania or Bulgaria, such as the Chinese. And since the EU accession, there is a constant but very modest influx of EU citizens. Still, post-transition immigration, if you look into it, is, as Remus mentioned, co-ethnic. It's dominated by returning labor migrants, pensioners, political immigrants, particularly in the early transition period, then second generation and so-called ancestral returnees, and returning war refugees. All migration dynamics, which I now briefly mentioned, contribute actually to the diversity or the heterogeneity of current Croatian society. However, this is not really a topic in public space. There is a general tendency of suspicion towards those who come from outside. What do these people bring us? And how is Croatian society going to change with the inertia against change? I think this is a big issue today. And also up for debate is, what are the so-called social remittances? So is there a contribution to pluralism, to internationalization, to modernization, to the opening up to competition, or rather to re-traditionalization, to nationalism, to the polarization of the society and the closing of networks? Croatia today is one of the biggest demographic losers, which is a very important factor in the debate. In Central and Eastern Europe, it's with Bulgaria and Romania, the country which shows most pronounced population losses due to the high emigration, but also the low birth rates, which were already mentioned before. There are projections of the population decline until 2050 of 22% of the population. Return and immigration has been able to sort of compensate the migration balance until the financial crisis, but then there was a slip into negative net migration, which since has only increased. So EU accession, as I mentioned, has once more accelerated immigration, but especially of young and well-educated people, and also of young families, which is now a focus in the debate, because they seem to be less likely to return once they've settled in a host society. So indeed, there is a demographic and a brain drain panic predominant in public discourse. Still, migration patterns are, like in other Central European countries, much more fluid since, especially since EU accession, and transnational modes of living are more and more common. The issue of registering those transnational modes of living is difficult and adds to the unclear data that we have to actually deal with. So it's a bit difficult to predict what's going to happen in the future. I'd like to close with a look into policies. The Act on Foreigners has been amended recently. In 2018, there was a further pro-immigration steps with regards to contingents or to specific sectors which need and are in search of labor, which was construction and particularly also hospitality industry in Croatia, but also manufacturing. Those contingents have now this year been lifted. So if there is no more sector-related migration policies, but rather a much more open approach to labor mobility, this can be a first step into developing pro-immigrant policies, which at least would, go 2 steps. In the academic arena, there are actually first steps taken into that direction with circular migration policies being supported. I also would like to mention with regards to Croatia and its large diaspora, that diaspora outreach and return policies have, it's a very mixed picture of to what extent they're successful, since returnees are faced with the same local conditions as anybody else who wants to make a living in Croatia. Returnees, on top of that, are often disadvantaged due to a lack of social capital and channels into local networks, which tend to be closed and very familial and also clientelistic. So to close here, even though the focus is shifting from emigration to immigration, I believe that it will be highly controversial whether immigration is an adequate means to counter labor market shortages and demographic decline. The debate will be heated, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. And now I'd like to hand the floor straight away to Michal Garapich so that he can fill us in on his research, which in particular focuses on Poland and also the Roma community. So, Michal.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me and opportunity to share a few thoughts. I'm in a kind of both advantages and disadvantages position that in terms of a lot of comments, a lot of observations, a lot of comments made by my predecessors basically apply to Poland too. So I won't bore the audience with repeating same stuff basically, because as on a macro structural level, a lot of these things also apply to Poland. Poland being the largest country in the region, of course, has its own dynamic, its own structural conditions that make some things unique. But in terms of the overall picture is fairly similar. As country slowly transitioning from a mainly sending country to receiving country with particular issues surrounding it, which are not that alien to what's been happening in Spain or Italy in the 90s and 2000s, or to other Western states in 60s and 70s. Predominantly, the increased tensions resulting from what James Holyfield called the liberal paradox, where the advanced liberal democracies and economies through migrations are led to certain paradox due to conflicting forces pulling it apart, because the economy needs migrants, sucks them in, and they fuel the oils of capitalist labor markets. But at the same time, so the economy closes the structures, opens the structures to immigrants, but the politics is more hostile. So and closes its structures to with various means. I mean, both by public attitudes, but also increased restrictions to mobility, etc. So the liberal paradox has been also present in Poland, and I think it's the most interesting case with the current government, which, as you probably know from the last elections, is fairly right-wing, likes to drum up the xenophobic, nationalistic drum to win elections. So nothing new here, not comparing to other states in Western Europe. And in particular during the refugee crisis in 2015 has actually been almost on the verge of far-right reproduction of discourse around immigration and refugees, comparing them to diseases and the threat of, obviously, Islamization of Europe, etc., etc. But at the same time, from the last 5 years, we've seen a massive increase in presence of immigrants in Poland, mainly from Ukraine, but also from China, India, Africa, and so on and so on. So it's a classic example of political, unfortunately also social hostility, not overwhelming, but to some extent, especially in the smaller town and rural areas, hostility to immigration, but on political and cultural level, coupled with economic openness, relative openness, of course, because we know the migrants mainly populated the secondary labor market, which is obviously known for quite precariousness and practices of exploitations, which obviously we witnessed that during the last few months as a result of the pandemic, where the first to lose their jobs were immigrants. But just to, I understand it's nothing new I say here, but I thought that I will say a few things to kind of follow up what Carolina said earlier on about social remittances, because obviously there's a big discussion around what are the cultural social effects of these massive flows of people back and forth and transnational living. In 2004, so post-EU accession, we estimate around 2 million Poles migrated abroad, although to count those that come and go or conduct certain transnational lifestyle, circular migration is difficult. It's difficult, so it's fair to say that much more people are engaged in these movements. If you count all these people's family members who remain in Poland, or the friends, etc., there's hardly any family, any social unit, any social context, any town, any village, any etc., any neighborhood that is not touched by immigration of its members, of population. So, and a lot of these people, obviously, with ease of travel, come back for good, or just for Christmas, or just for holidays, etc. And so they exchange ideas. They tell them how things are in whether they are, and so we could expect some social cultural change due to these movements. And the picture is quite paradoxical here, because from one perspective we see certain liberalization of views regarding to gender issues, to church and state relations, etc., etc. And it's but as you've probably seen 2 weeks ago and a month ago, with some surprise, the current president got re-elected on a fairly close xenophobic and very homophobic ideas around essentially telling the electorate that LGBT ideology is up to uproot true Polish identity, and there is no place for ideology like that in Poland. And given the fact that we assume people with experience in the West, have assumed certain liberal ideas around gender issues and have been contesting some of the heteronormative ideas of, in particular, Polish conservative, particularly Catholic traditions. We would assume that to drum up homophobic ideas in the elections is a loser. It's basically it's a no-winner. It's not a right way to go. Unfortunately, it seemed to work. So the other paradox of social remittances is that we and from our research and from research of others, it seems that it has a kind of a fairly conservative and retraditionalization aspect of that. So it's people who migrate and come back very often presents ideas that strengthen conservative and traditional Catholic outlooks. It's very often related to their position in the labour market, where their insecurity abroad led them to believe that, well, they are second-class citizens and they are treated badly, and also that very often strengthen their racist attitude, because for some migrants it might seem obvious that as white Christian Europeans they should be treated better, and when they end up in very mixed ethnic neighbourhoods in London or Manchester or Sheffield, their sense of who they are being disrupted. Some people adapt to that very easily and strive and are happy to operate in that environment. Others who might be less secure or might lose in that competition, obviously claim that this is all down to discrimination of white Christian Europeans, which, on the other hand, strengthen the anti-immigrants, very often kind of anti-Islamic attitudes, which, if you look at Polish history, has a kind of quite long legacy there. So just to wrap up all this, I think it's very important to stress that we passed the moment where we can look at societies as separate, obviously, and British society and Polish society, as Romanian, Latvian and Croatian, overlap, and there are common sets. There are British Poles who operate in both spaces, influencing both societies. And I think we have to be careful not to assume that would result in growth of liberal values or growth of democratic adherence to freedom, and equality, because in some contexts it actually strengthened quite growing populist discourse around exclusionary ideas of Europe, of democracy, of Christianity, which is obviously treated as synonymous with Europe. Essentially, it might embolden some populist, racist, right-wing political ideas around migration. And I think it's fair to say that we are, in a way, at certain crossroads with societies like Poland or, say, Croatia or Romania, which began to normalize and began to look at the ethnic homogeneity in normative terms as something good or something should be preserved. This is a very dangerous route, of course, we know. And I think this is something which obviously politicians, policymakers need to recognize. Hence it's not a surprise, for example, that quite a lot of influential Polish organizations, Polish lobby groups, diasporic lobby groups, for example, presented Brexit as an opportunity or presented Brexit as something that actually is worth pursuing because it leads to dismantling of this horrible beast called the European Union. So I think we need to recognize again that these political forces are contradictory. Social remittances are not always leading to liberalization or growth of liberal values. They can sometimes, social remittances can have an opposite effect. But we'll see in time how things will shape up. As I said, Poland is increasingly diverse, increasingly accepts that heterogeneity of the labor force is a norm, hence heterogeneity of its social makeup is the norm, as it always been up to the Second World War. But the road to that acceptance and normalization of that understanding and accepting it is going to be bumpy, I guess. So I think I'll end up here, and I hope there will be more opportunity to talk about this as a result of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michal. And we do have questions coming in. Please do continue to send questions. If you have any for any particular member of the panel, please indicate that in your question. And thank you. I would like to come back to the issue of social remittances and attitudes in society. But first of all, I'd just like to ask one or two of the questions we've had. I think this one, I'll leave the panel to raise their hand to see who wants to take this one. One question's come in. Based on your research, are there any measures that can be taken by governments or NGOs who could assist the governments to assist returnees and to help with integration into countries in this region, as integration appears to have very poor outcomes in most of the countries we've talked about? Perhaps Carolina, do you have any recommended policies that you've witnessed good success with?
Yeah, thank you. There is a certain experience that we have in Croatia with not only promoting but assisting return. And there is an institution which is called the Welcome Office, which is part of a bigger administrative body, which is which is for Croatians abroad. It has a long title, that office, which I won't repeat, but it's in fact due to its responsibility is to take care of Croatians in the diaspora, in the neighborhood, Croatian minorities, and so on and so forth, and to assist return. I think return migration, though, has to be looked at in a much wider context of what is actually the situation in the country in general. And returnees, as I was mentioning, can be assisted to find a place to stay, to find a language course, to actually be networked and so forth, but then they need to keep running on their own, and in an environment which is relatively closed still and networked, especially also in the economic sphere. So there is no the openness of
Oh dear, Carolina, your screen has frozen and we can't hear you. As we've lost Carolina momentarily, I think apologies, Carolina, you froze for a moment there, so we didn't catch the last part.
There are long bureaucratic procedures. It doesn't go, there's no quick way into setting up a company, for example. So it's not a very entrepreneurial environment still. However, there's efforts done to actually improve those conditions. But then there you have a strong internal reflex against things and people coming from outside. I can also say this for the academic environment, which you would assume is a very open environment for international cooperation. It is partly so, but in other parts, it's still very closed. And there is also a certain degree of fear to open up towards international competition. So return migrants often, especially if they have if they are second generation or even later generations, have a nostalgic sense of homecoming, which is doomed to actually be disappointed once they arrive, because they actually do an immigration of kind, but believe that through family ties and a history and an imagined history and homeland, it could be much easier. However, there is lots of disappointment, and as Inta has pointed out, often leads to people leaving once again. However, the picture is very mixed, because the living between different countries, 2, 3, and family knots in those different societies is also becoming more and more common. People are moving around and also are actually feeding on the international way of life they're leading, and materializing it, and also converting it into some sort of an entrepreneurial approach to dealing with this transnational lifestyle which has come about. So I wouldn't overestimate the role of policies and also agencies to assist return migrants, but they could definitely assist in making it more visible what return migrants are experiencing, for influencing the public discourse, for creating awareness that there is something happening which is often fairly ignored by local populations.
Thank you. And I'd just like to ask Inta, I think you have a Latvian perspective for us.
Yeah, thank you. We've conducted several large surveys of immigrants and return migrants, where we asked them, what is it that they're struggling with? How can we help you? And we're also going to convey that knowledge to the policymakers. And I'm happy to say that some of these things have kind of materialized in the diaspora law. So basically, many things can be done, many things. One is that the major issue that the return migrants struggle with is integration in the labor market. It's sometimes difficult to understand, but how is it that they don't know, for example, where to search for information? But really, in the surveys, you see that yes, they just say, I didn't really know where to go to, how to look for this information. So providing adequate information on the labor market, on vacancies is one thing. Also, many of them are very entrepreneurial. They have gathered all these ideas and thoughts of what they could be doing, what businesses they could open. So they need information about the government provided support for establishing businesses, and there are special support also for return migrants currently. In general, they struggle with information about taxes, about social security, about healthcare. So again, this is the information that they need. And currently, for example, the government has established a network of regional coordinators where they can call, they can write, they can ask questions, where should I go, what should I do? And, and people will help them. So that's really nice. Also, integration of children in the school system, a major issue, because children assimilate very quickly abroad. This is what we found. And actually, in some cases, that becomes a reason why the parents return, because they just get overwhelmed with the situation that the child cannot speak Latvian to them anymore. They just get assimilated so quickly, and then they return because they want the child to grow up in the Latvian environment. But here they come, and the schools are not ready to work with these kids who don't speak Latvian. So they need to teach the teachers, they need to, prepare the schools and provide adequate support. So also for the spouses that are often non-Latvians and also don't speak the language. So, but the major issue really is what we found in our research, what we did not expect to find, kind of a surprise, was that most return migrants, for most return migrants, the decision to return is a spontaneous one. It's that, just something happens, something snaps and say, oh, that's it. I'm sick of it. I'm going home, or I don't know, an elderly parent falls ill, or something happens. And, just 1/3 of return migrants said that they actually had a work that they knew that they'll be working in. that they actually had work arrangements. Most of them, they just come home and then they look for opportunities. Now, what can I do here? Okay, I'll have a break for a month or two. So obviously, in this kind of situation, it's very, very likely that they will not find what they're looking for, and they will be forced to emigrate again. So in this context, we are talking about sustainable return. How do we achieve a sustainable return so that the person would not just come back, but would also stay in the country? Right? And actually, one of the solutions we came up with was creating a better link between these employers that need workforce in Latvia and the diaspora who are looking for opportunities to return. Right? So currently, there's also an NGO that has established a website called Your Move, where that brings together these two sides without the interference of policymakers, and that really helps to make this return sustainable. So, thank you.
Thank you, Inta. And I'd just like to turn to Michal now to comment. I know he's got a few comments to make.
Yes, I think in terms of policies, it's a very tricky thing because policies related to migration are not always about immigration. I'm just quoting Douglas Massey here from the US, who was, for some period was advising Obama on his immigration policy reform, to his frustration, of course, to Douglas Massey's frustration, because in a way, immigration policies created on top level about restrictions of movement, about who to bring in, who to keep out, are not about immigrants, okay? They are a way the state currently reproduces its power to identify members, okay? It's not about immigration, it's about the state's assertion of its monopoly on movement, and in an increased globalized mobile world where people increasingly live or can lead lives across the borders, states' power to control mobility is under threat. So in a way, policies towards returnees are also a way that states assert their readiness to take care of its citizens or to shape policies towards them. And in the Polish case, I'm sort of allowing myself this longer digression, because in the Polish case, the policies towards returnees are as old as migration itself. You can trace it to the 19th century, where every uprising in Poland was basically making calls to its diaspora for help. In First and Second World War, the same. There were calls for diaspora to contribute, same during communist times, and after '89, where there was an expectation that diaspora will kind of chip in and help. I guess it was the same situation in many Eastern European countries. So in a way, but you have to see the underlying logic of exclusion there, because it's not that in creating policies towards migrants and returnees, the state wants everyone. I've seen these policies towards post-2004, post-EU migrants made by Polish states, and I don't think. It was clear who they want. Okay, they want young graduates with thick wallets and thick social capital in their backpacks. Okay, ideally, handsome and ready to contribute to the Polish labour market. And I, in my research around homelessness and with homeless and with consular office, it was a constant problem that any authority high up in Polish state structure, whether the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Labour Affairs, etc., was explicit about this, obviously off the record, to say, well, we don't really want these homeless people to come back. We want specific people to come back. So I guess this is a constant thing we have to bear in mind. At the same time, obviously, the social policies are these days decentralized, and a lot of problems faced by people who return are similar across the board in many countries. And I think it's important to mention here, obviously, as Inta mentioned, the schooling, for example. Schooling is the key issue here, because kids who return, they return to a foreign country. They don't re-emigrate very often. They just go to a new country. They migrate. So in a way, you have to shift your thinking about not treating them as returnees, but as a different kind of migrants who basically have the particular different needs. But as I said, I mean, I'm just basically very, very suspicious, very critical of any kind of policies towards diaspora, because it's usually around, it's a creation of a lobby interest group, okay, which then is dependent on government money or diaspora engagement policies. That's the case in Poland, but I guess it's the case in other countries too.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to pose this question to Remus to get the full set of opinions, and then we only have time for just a few more questions. So Remus, would you like to give us the Romanian perspective on that question?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. I think I very much embark on what Michal said before. I was looking a little bit on returning in Romania in the past, let's say 6-7 years. And on the one hand, it's a very diversified process, and there are different types of returnees. Whenever we talk about policies for return, at least in the Romanian case, it's much more about bringing back those returnees able to become entrepreneurs, right? So these valued people. At the same time, when you do research among Roma returnees, for instance, put it bluntly, nobody cares about them, right? So if Roma returnees return to the same segregated neighborhood, not even at the local authorities, I mean, their potential is not recognized, not even there, right? So it's much more a focus towards, let's say, entrepreneurs, people who are able to do something for the country. But at the same time, looking at the data, quite a lot of returnees are actually less educated people. So people who go to work in agriculture and return. So people having rather work in secondary labor market and return. And there isn't much on that. I mean, it's almost nothing. And there is another one argument about context. So far, Romania wasn't keen in setting up return policies. Just in the past 2-3 years, when the loss of population was so big, they started to do something for return. But it's again very, very feeble. So on the one hand, it's much more targeting, let's say, desirable returnees. We want to have blonde hair, blue eyes, smart guys with money, right, who return, and not everybody. And secondly, it's also inconsistency in policy and government. I mean, if you want to settle up an agenda, you have to set up an agenda that can last a little bit more than 1 or 2 years. So, and this consistency I haven't seen so far, right? And last thing, talking about the variability of returnees, there are very many returnees with no context to the country of origin, with no knowledge of the country of origin and no social ties back home. So that are driven by kind of desire to return to the ancestors' land. But there are very many others who are very well connected on the ground, right? And any kind of policy should take into account this variation existing on the ground. Yeah, this will be my view on the matter. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think Inta just has one final thought to add on this question.
Yes, just one more thought to what Carolina said and Remus, that these people really often don't have ties that disadvantage them in many ways in the labor market and society. So what has worked in the Latvian situation is that they have established an organization of return migrants, and they help each other. So that's a nice solution that we have found here. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd like to before I turn to another question, I'd just like to thank Nikolai Ratsiu for that question. It's clearly an awful lot to answer in that question. I'd now like to wrap up 2 questions. One is from Donny Reed in London, and the question is, do EU regulations regarding movement of labour require to be readdressed to mitigate migration and protect labour markets in Central and Eastern Europe? And the other question I don't have a name for it, I'd like to ask is, it's relating to the COVID-19 pandemic and the spotlight that has shed on particularly the lower skilled agricultural workers coming from Eastern and Central Europe working in countries like Germany and the UK, and the treatment that they've been experiencing has become much more scrutinized, much more publicly acknowledged, and whether or not this is an opportunity for the European Union to rethink its how it scrutinizes treatment of migrants generally within the Union. So the question about the European regulations on migration, I don't know who would like to pick up on that. Perhaps Remus, do you have any opinions on that?
One of the, yes, somehow, I mean, half of it, I mean, basically related to the COVID and situation of at least Romanians in slaughterhouses in farms in Germany. I think one of the things that struck me somehow is that during the pandemic, there were cases of, let's say, Italians who brought Romanians to work with private jets, right? And this was an exception. I mean, during the pandemic, it was the first time in very, very many years where Europe's borders were locked, but not for agricultural workers. So what does this mean? It means that these people are really important. So a lot of discourses about migrants are kind of wish and unwish migrants. Agricultural workers are ranking the last, right? So they are not necessarily the people we want to, but this showed how important they are, right? And the situations in the context of COVID, there were two cases in Germany, one in Gütersloh and the other one close to Dingolfing, with agriculture, with workers, first in slaughterhouses and then second in agriculture work. They got the COVID. And basically what it means is that the subcontracting situations in Germany put these people at risk. I mean, these are situations that are very important, not just for these people, but mostly for these people. And whenever they have to work in a different country, they have to have the same rights. And these rights should be enforced, right? And this situation showed that their rights and their safety was not important as the safety of the others, right? Theoretically, it shows the fragility and vulnerability of these people, right? Staying 10 people in a house and working in a slaughterhouse where it's impossible to promote distancing measures. And I think much more should have been done in this respect, at least, because it was ironical. I mean, these people left Romania during the pandemic because the Romanian government allowed them to go. In Romania, in companies, in fabrics, they implemented distancing measures. But going to the West, some of these people were working in contexts where distancing measures weren't implemented, right? So this shows that kind of imbalance that we talk about, the inequality that we talk about.
I wonder, two questions that come from that. One is whether there's a reduced appetite for emigration in countries in the region because they've become more aware perhaps of how difficult the situation can be in these sorts of industries in countries like Germany, and also whether there is any political appetite for constraining the opportunities to emigrate. I don't know, perhaps if Inta has any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, well, what we are concerned about in the context of the COVID crisis is that it is possible that it will turn the mood in a society a little bit more against return migrants, against return migration. We don't have concrete evidence right now, but what we see, what the general feeling is, right, that people are saying, like, why should they return now? You know, these other countries have much worse situation. The situation in other countries is worse, so there's a high probability that they will bring COVID here. So why can't they stay, you know, at least longer? so that's the concern. We don't see that the crisis is going to lead to higher immigration rates. Again, we don't have concrete evidence right now, but it seems to us that we would rather expect a little bit more of return migration, because like crises like this, they really lead people to re-evaluation of values, of what is important and what is not. And you know, not being able, for example, to be with your family during the crisis is difficult. right? If your family is in a different country, not being able to travel to see them, especially if somebody is sick, for example. So again, that leads to reevaluation of these economic benefits that you gain versus the fact that you're separated from your family. Yeah, so that would be my take on it.
Thank you. And I think Carolina has something to add to that.
Well, the idea of mobility and the four freedoms in the European Union, in theory, are supposed to contribute to convergence. But in practice, or what we've been discussing here, is the tendency to peripheralization and to, via brain drain also, to creating strains in the countries of origins in specific sectors. And it is striking how egoistic or how nationally driven, interest-driven migration policies in fact are being handled. And I think this is something that also COVID is drawing to much more strikingly to our attention, and something that needs to be addressed in future. Migration dynamics are reciprocal dynamics between different players, or let's say host and home societies, and should actually be also taken into consideration from both sides. We see a fairly aggressive recruitment policy from some states in order to fill labor shortages in sectors such as the caretaking industries, which create in the long run strains in the sending societies in those sectors. And the idea or the approach to discuss bilaterally circular migration policies is at least pointing into the right direction of taking on responsibility for such dynamics and for what they cause in the medium term. And in that respect, I think migration policy within the European Union has a lot of space for improvement, and should take concern about the effects of outmigration if there's no return. And circular migration can actually, in cross-sectoral approaches, also be taken care of when industry is being introduced in policy making. You see a sectoralization of policy making, and not enough involvement of the private sector, for example, in policy making.
I'd like to ask my own question, but I'll combine it with one that we've had in from the audience. Perhaps this is something that Mihai and Remus might be interested to pick up on. I wonder if one of the outcomes of the pandemic has made people particularly wary of people who move around. The idea that, I know this was the case in Romania, there was a fear that returning migrants were introducing COVID-19 into villages and towns across Romania, and I imagine the same is true across the region. So I wonder if this pandemic potentially feeds into the anti-immigrant rhetoric that the more right-wing political parties tend to use, which are obviously across the region fairly powerful. But I'd also like to add into that the question from Alexandru Nan, who's at UCL in the economics department, who asks, do members of the panel believe that it's acceptable to override the wish of the populations in these countries for restricted immigration, considering this action could lead to more bitter divisions in societies of the region? So that question of whether or not this really will divide societies more, perhaps drive a more anti-EU sentiment across certain sections of society. Remus, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, in Romania, I mean, what we have, I mean, there isn't much opposition to immigration. I mean, we started to, not just about Moldovans, but I mean, in public, there was no policy against the Moldovans' arrival, for instance. Although, of course, people can mock or tell jokes about Moldovans, but in reality, there is no opposition to it. And right now, we are just in the phase of, let's say, incipient immigration, where Vietnamese migration it's growing, or other of people from other regions, but you don't see strong. It's a kind of paradox. On the one hand, there isn't much discourse against it. So I don't see divisions, bitter divisions in respect to the newly arriving immigrants, because they are rather portrayed as they are good for the economy. And as far as everybody knows that so many Romanians are away and the economy needs, somehow it's a kind of, not social contract could be too much, but it's a kind of acceptance of that. But I would expect that with the growth of immigration, then public divisions can appear, then anti-immigration discourses can spread, right? This is my take on the matter. But at the moment, at least, there isn't, I mean, in Hungary had a very clear anti-immigration policy, right, top down. The good part for Romania is that we don't have that at the moment, right? There were 1 or 2 cases where local people were reacting against the arrival of Sri Lankans, but when they moved to a different part of the country, nothing happened, right? So it's not a generalized phenomenon. I wouldn't describe it like that. So first of all, wait and see how it goes on.
Thank you.
I think that you'll need to distinguish between the sort of the policies created ad hoc as a kind of knee-jerk reaction, and their implementation and their real practical application, because in the long run, or even in the midterm run, labor market shortages will widen. Okay, Poland and Romania will need more carers, will need more people working in the hospitality industry, more in the health sector. So where are these people going to come from? I mean, it's a no-brainer here. So if there's going to be a kind of, again, I think widening of Holyfield liberal paradox, where the economy opens up because these people are needed, and the political hostility. But again, political hostility is a construct that we often, just deduct from basically big political events, elections, riots, stuff like that. But on micro level, politics is very often driven by local issues, and I think in Poland there you also have the kind of local issues in big cities are fairly pro-immigrant. Okay, people have a more general understanding that cities are kind of run by immigrants, and they oil their daily services. In smaller cities, rural areas, things are different. But,
thank you. I think Inta has an extra point to make on this one.
Yes, well, we live in a democratic society, and obviously the government should not go against the wishes of the population. At the same time, what is important is to have an open and informed debate about these matters. For example, if the society decides that, yes, we don't want to let anyone in, we don't want, we will try to look for some other solutions. That's one thing, right? But we can try to go the way of Japan, right? It's also very much anti-immigrant, but then you have to also talk about the consequences. You have to talk about the problems for the sustainability of the social security system with the aging society and immigration and stuff. You have to talk about the need that you will have to raise, for example, the retirement age by a lot, that, we will have problems in the economy and so on and so on. So we will have to search for solutions. The problem in Latvia is that we haven't really talked openly about these issues. We've talked about how big of a problem immigration is. We haven't really had this open debate about whether we should or should not facilitate immigration. I know from my own research, for example, that people's attitudes are very different, for example, towards migrants from different parts of the world, or the ethnic migrants and co-ethnics and others and stuff. So basically, in general, we have to have debate about this, but the parties in Latvia have been, I guess, too scared maybe to bring up even these issues, considering the society in general has very negative attitudes, similarly to Poland and Hungary. Of course, there are some exceptions. It's not everyone, but in general, that's how it is, and we have to start talking about this.
Thank you. I'd just like to bring in Carolina for her perspective on this.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to echo this from the Croatian perspective. I perceive Croatia as a very conservative society, which is inert to change and concerning what direction to take. It's highly polarized, and discourse is usually centered much more about the past and around the issues concerning the past of the society rather than the future. And I definitely think that starting to talk about return migration and perceiving and understanding what return migrants actually contribute to the society in all the ways in which it is happening would be a first step to start discussing what is coming in the nearer future. We are still, this might be specific to Croatia much more than to the other societies here, since we were the last newcomer to the European Union very recently. Immigration is not yet a fact. It's just starting to come up at the horizon as a development perspective for the local economy. And therefore, I think to first look into what is actually taking place and has been taking place in terms of return migration from the diaspora, from different generations, would be a first step into understanding how diversified Croatian society has become actually through people who've been outside and have come back. And it would start a sensibilization towards what internationalization actually means and what effects there are on social, local society. So I think we are really at the beginning of a very, profound development, which, however, isn't yet taking place.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are out of time. So I don't know if any speakers would like to have a sort of final word, just to send the audience off with some ideas for how immigration into Eastern Europe can be approached in the future, as Caroline's pointed out. Any takers? Very quiet. Oh, Remus has waved in.
Yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about political culture. I mean, I was talking to a Spanish social scientist who was arguing that actually in Spain, the way in which immigrants were portrayed was much in a more tolerant way than in other European countries. So on the one hand, it's of course the need of these countries to receive immigrants. There is of course straight off for the population who will feel that their jobs are affected by the arrival of new immigrants. But how we talk about immigrants in public space, I think it's very important. How are they framed? How are they portrayed? And because this can also have an influence on the population. I mean, we live in a societies where TV and internet are ruling actually, right? And how these people are portrayed in TV and internet is fundamental for how people are reacting and understanding the arrival, either the return of connationals, the notion of diversity, and the way in which immigrants can have a contribution to these societies. In very many countries, it is not clear that immigrants are fundamental for these societies. And I think Central Eastern Europe should learn the lesson and should address it. It's much more kind of normative and somehow could be a utopian idea to try to think that in Central Eastern Europe will happen differently. But I think this is one key issue, the way in which we talk about these people and the political culture we can have in these countries. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope that will occur in Central and Eastern Europe in a more measured way than it has perhaps in Western countries, including the United Kingdom. I'm afraid we really are out of time, so I'll have to wrap things up there. But thank you, all four of you, for this really fascinating discussion. Clearly, there are so many issues around migration generally that we could talk for hours and hours without even feeling we've begun to exhaust the topic. So thank you very much for giving us as incisive an insight as you could in the brief time that I gave you. So I'd like to thank you all. So Carolina Tomić, Inta Mieriņa, Michal Garapich, and Remus Anghel. I'd also like to thank the RATSU Forum, who are our partners in this event, and my colleagues at LSE Ideas, who have been managing all of the technical side of things. So thank you to the audience for joining us for this discussion. And I hope that you will be able to join us again for another of our 2020 Visions Ratio Forum events in the future. Thank you all very much, and goodbye.